Hey folks, Brandy here. Friday the 13th is going on now. We also have the moon has entered in Gemini. It's almost full. It's going to be full starting Saturday. When the moon's full in Gemini, in particular, we might feel like the need to release information, release things that we've been kind of like holding in. Gemini is like a sign tied to communication, flexibility, knowledge, technology, information, but we're in a Mercury retrograde right now, and we're also in a Mars retrograde right now. So that could cause miscommunication, misinformation. It could cause disruption or arguments or disagreements. So we have to be really cautious of how we're using our energy and the information that we're sharing. Um, Full moons are a really great time to cleanse, release, reflect, review, kind of give ourselves a chance um, to get rid of stuff that we don't want to hold on to anymore. It's a time to illuminate the things that are hidden so we can take action going forward. When it comes to this particular lunation, I just wanted to get on here because today's Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th is such a funny holiday nowadays. It's not even like a holiday, but horror fans they love Friday the 13th. But I wanted to get on and talk a little bit about where the kind of superstition or originated from and kind of help shed some light on that for folks. So, one of the things I like to talk about is suppressed histories or examples of women being knowledge bearers pre Judeo Christian era. And that actually is something that ties really well with Friday the 13th. So, when it comes to Friday, uh, pre-Christian pagan eras, goddesses associated with the divine feminine sexuality. So, like, we're talking Freya, Aphrodite, Venus, Inanna. We're talking, these are the kinds of like goddesses we're talking about. They were typically associated with Friday. It's kind of a Venusian energy. Okay, so Friday actually comes from the concept of Freya, which is the Norse goddess of sex, love, and war. And when it comes to Friday the 13th, 13 in kind of the divine feminine or pre-Judeo-Christian uh, religions. I shouldn't even say religion, more like spirituality, honored the divine feminine, which were kind of signified through lunations or through the moon. And so, for example, one of the things that we can look at is how the body actually sheds its uterine lining once a month, or usually in association with lunation calendars. If you are someone who is synced with the moon, I know I am. And so, what we were seeing pre Judeo Christian, culture was celebrating Friday the 13th as almost kind of like a sacred day, honoring the divine feminine. If you consider, the concept of the moon being tied to the uterus or the moon being tied to the womb, it's really a day that was kind of really more so affiliated or associated with women and the moon. And then what happened was in the 1300s, we see kind of an effort to create erasure of a lot of that historical information in order to push forward more Christian or Judeo Christian values. I should say Abrahamic religions or Abrahamic values. And so during those times, we see all these efforts to eliminate or remove that kind of information from society, from culture. It becomes suppressed. But there are still people that carry some of those traditions in their everyday practices, because those traditions weren't necessarily tied to worshiping a person or a specific, like, God or deity as the ultimate source. It was more so tied to just keeping track of time, or keeping track of the moon and the sun and different solar events, so you knew what time of the year you were in, so that you knew basically calendar wise what things you were preparing for, what you might want to celebrate when it comes to um, survival and harvest and community. So it really is not necessarily affiliated with like some sort of like deification necessarily. It's just more so tied to a way of keeping track of, feminine cycles and rhythms. And that there's nothing, nothing evil about that. So it's just funny how currently there's this kind of horror culture tied to Friday the 13th. And that actually didn't start until the Victorian era, when we had like a new wave of superstitious energy show up. Post, and I talked about this kind of in my tarot class. It's kind of like this fascination with the occult, and kind of this belief of good and evil, this kind of binarism, that further locked in kind of this culture around fear, and horror and the grotesque and whatnot. So, really wanted to shed some light on Friday the 13th today. It's actually a holiday tied to sex and love, and the concept of, feeling beauty and feeling in tune with your body, and feeling aligned when it comes to kind of the natural world. Okay. There's a book that I'm gonna read here. I just picked it up. It's called When God Was a Woman, and it's by Merlin Stone. This is an older book. It's from the 70s, but I'm not sleeping on the 70s, folks that were doing a lot of that feminist history work and uncovering things and trying to share them with us during that time. But I had made a video on TikTok earlier this week when I was having some stomach issues and I wasn't feeling so hot. And I thought I'd read this passage again from Tending Grief here, and remake it. But I want to read this to you because it's particularly relevant to the things that we're seeing right now, tied to healthcare, tied to regulation of the body, and kind of trying to infringe upon the rights of the body, when it comes to working, when it comes to labor, when it comes to reproduction, and also when it comes to spirituality and even medicinal knowledge. So this is a book called Tending Grief, and it's by Camille Sapara Barton. And I just want to read one page to you. During the Middle Ages, the witch burning times also created a huge wound and rupture within communities in Europe and later in the newly formed colonies on Turtle Island. That's the US. Generally, those with a comprehensive knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, and healing practices, often within peasant communities, think about that, were targeted as witches. The witch burning times lasted for more than 200 years, and they are estimated to have killed over 40,000 women, though documentation from this period is limited, so the number of deaths may have been higher. Spoiler alert, they were. If you took my Salem Witch Trials class, you have the details. Okay, during this time, a culture of fear arose. Families, neighbors, and communities turned against each other. People began to accuse others just so they themselves would be saved. In addition to those in power doing away with the commons, the place where a community would go gather to farm, the practice Oh, shoot, I just messed up. In addition to those in power doing away with the commons, which was a place where a community would gather to farm together, the practice of hunting witches was instrumental in shaping capitalism as a system. It helped the powerful form a political and social set of relationships within the economy that denigrates yet relies upon women's unpaid and reproductive labor. As a political strategy, the witch hunt was a horrific and effective way to reduce dissent. It served to limit the power that women healers had to wipe away indigenous cosmologies and herbal knowledge systems, and to ensure that power over healing the body could be centralized and authorized by the hands of the newly formed male led medical profession. And those of you who have taken some of my classes where I talk about the Age of Enlightenment, that was shortly something that followed up the witch burning trials, or the witch burning era. And the Age of Enlightenment is. It occurred during the same type of astrology that we're actually going through right now. Okay. In Caliban and the Witch, Sylvia Federici speaks to how essential the witch burning times were for the economic elites. The horrible disruption of the witch hunts allowed them to usher in capitalism and regain control after the Black Death. The plague had severely depleted the number of workers in Europe, which had given them more agency to set their fees and working conditions. Think about that. The church, alongside economic elites, regained power by taking control of women's reproductive labor, by forcing them to bear children, whose numbers increased the workforce. Dissent was suppressed through the witch hunts by disciplining or killing anyone who would not conform to this agenda. In looking at our ancestral past, people of European descent cannot avoid this history of pain, betrayal, violence, and a deep severing from land and plant knowledge systems they had once known. It's a painful yet necessary wound for us to touch into, to notice the ways this history has conditioned our bodies and social relationships in the West. So this is another example of a wave of control that was used to strip women away from knowledge, sort of kind of like how the Abrahamic religions, when they started like taking shape, also did. And so, what I would say here with this knowledge from tending grief is we're seeing a lot of these examples of how to control, the workforce, how to control the body, how to, everyone's talking about babies. How do we fix the baby bubble? And if you look at the authors of Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, they actually posted a blog about their recommendation for fixing the baby bubble that has burst, is to reduce women's overconsumption of knowledge or education, and increase more Christian, like Christian knowledge, so that they'll produce babies rather than